Okay, Halo the bar. To Yah goes the glory, and just as a end note, real quick. Uh, because again, I understand the sensitivity a lot of times with the other portion of the of the Bible that will remain nameless at the moment. But because I understand people when you have these conversations with them and we start talking about the greats, these GOAT conversations, and it's easy for those names again from that side of the book to be mentioned, to be thrown into the mix and say, oh, he's clearly the great. And it's like, cool, I'm not, listen, I don't have a problem with people's opinions, and because we all have opinions or whatever. But again, my vantage point is a little bit different as I've gotten older, because again, I have to look at these things and say, it's easy to replicate prior greatness because the blueprint's already there. So again, from a sport standpoint, it's easy for Kobe Bryant to be considered the great when he pretty much replicated Michael Jordan's format. It's easy to replicate. It is not easy to innovate, to start from scratch and say, you know what? There is no template here. I'm going to create this template by the power of the Most High. If the Most High blesses my hands and my mind to do it, I'm going to create the template. I'm not going to base it off of anybody else's pre-existing anything. So when we talk about the greats, you got to step in and say, how did this individual shift the culture, shift every aspect of who we are as a people, and not only shift it, but made it so that any other approach to it is now obsolete, because you can no longer go the old way of doing things. You now have to take this master class from these individuals. And there's not many master class level individuals in scripture. We have great men of scripture, great women of scripture, but the innovators are a special breed. Moshe is an innovator because he came out with a people who were they were, for all intent purposes, they were Egyptian. They weren't Hebrews. They were Egyptian. They were out of their minds. All of them were out of their minds. And this is what Moshe had to stay and say, okay, you know what? We're going to start from scratch. Whatever the old timetable we were dealing with in Egypt, that's done. You see what Exodus 12 is like, listen, this day, we're going to move forward in this timetable. Whatever we were doing in Egypt is of no consequence anymore because we don't need their time. Yah is our time. He's going to dictate how we move and when we move. So Moshe, this is the reason why when we talk about Moshe and him being the man of Elohim, not the Adam or the Enosh, that almost sounds like something from we did before, or whatever, but the Ish, this manly man of Elohim, it puts him in a completely different bracket now. Ezra is in a completely different bracket. These are the type of individuals, Deborah, different bracket. These are the kind of individuals that we have to look at and say, you know what, we cannot let their testimony, let their legacy die off because of a lack of popularity. So even in today's scheme of things, when we look at when we mention all of the greats of this dispensation of time, in America, we always hear about the Ben Amis, of course. Toda Yah for that man, for that elder's life, and everything that he and those elders with him were able to accomplish in their respective positions. We always hear about we hear about the YBYs. I'll say it that way. We hear about, because the prominence, not necessarily the righteousness but the prominence of the name. That name is always there. We always hear about the elders that came out of ISUBK. Why? Because they're everywhere. They're on the streets. I mean, you can't miss certain individuals. So sometimes people become great not because of what they've done, but they become great because of notoriety. But then what about the individuals who gave birth to that? So when people talk about ISUBK and their greatness, the first thing I go and say, well, what about the other two? There's two other individuals that have to be given their honor before you can start having any conversation about what's happening. Three, matter of fact, before you can have any conversations about the greatness of ISUBK. The first one is the one who started the whole thing to begin with, Prophet F.S. Cherry. Now, how does Prophet F.S. Cherry have a connection to ISUBK? Well, here we go. Prophet F.S. Cherry's, one of his star pupils was a man who later became known as Eber Ben Yamin, later called Abba Bivens. Abba Bivens was the father of ISUBK, of what became ISUBK. But then there's a third individual that we have to talk about before we can touch ISUBK as well. And this is not a shot to ISUBK. I salute them, brothers. They've done their part in their work. No problems. But then we got to start talking about Nasi Yaakov, because it was Nasi Yaakov's vision in the late 1940s coming out of Cincinnati and then eventually going to New York and Chicago, where he made the definitive separation between and he basically ended the Black Jew era and he ushered in the Hebrew Israelite era. So now you could no longer wear yarmulkes. You could no longer dress like you're coming from World War II Poland. You now had to wear the kepo, like the one that we're wearing, the one that Prince right now has on. Now you're wearing the kepo. Now you're wearing the earrings. Now you have the armlets. Now you have the frontlets. Now you have the long garments, the fringes, all of these things that, that Nasi Yaakov and his cadre of individuals were able to introduce in the 1940s and 50s that gave rise to everything that came afterwards. But more importantly, there was a student of Nasi Yaakov named Nasi Barak, interestingly enough, who was very close with Abba Bivens, the great Abba Bivens, most I bless his memory. And Nasi Barak was responsible for bringing culture to Abba Bivens' original organization called the Israelite School of Tanakh in the late 1960s. So that's when you start seeing Abba Bivens take off the yarmulke and start seeing him wear turbans, the nose rings, the earrings. You start seeing the shift in that organization. And so they went from a Black Jew organization to a full-fledged Hebrew Israelite organization. And then when that elder died from a beating that he took in Newark, New Jersey, by the hands of the same organization that sanctioned the assassination of Malcolm X, the same NOI organization, after he passed, his students, Masha or Moshe Ben Kareem, Ariel Ben Yehuda, which later became Chief High Priest Ariah, and other individuals, they went away from that school name and they created, years later, the organization called Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. And so now when you see them with the turbans and you see them with all of this regalia and they're like, yeah, 1969 is when we started, you got to realize that, well, not really. That is not what happened. There are individuals who came before you that gave your teacher a glimpse and a touch of Hebrew culture and got us closer to what it meant to be an Israelite, not just theologically, but culturally, but mentally. And these are the men who are single-handedly responsible for the evolution of arguably the largest Israelite organization that we've seen on this side of the waters, and that is ISUBK. But their prominence came from Abba Bivens, Nasi Yaakov, and of course the pioneer of pioneers, Prophet F.S. Cherry from the 1880s. So it's important. So I bring that up only to say that we have to be very careful, because it's easy to get caught up in our own greatness, because all of us are bringing massive works and massive ideas to the table in Israel. And it's easy for us to kind of puff out our chests and say, yeah, I have done X, Y, Z. Well, yeah. Or I have seen this, or I have seen, right. But it's easy for us to do that when we're standing on other people's shoulders. If standing on someone's shoulders, of course you can see very far down the line. You're on their shoulders. So let's acknowledge the shoulders. Let's make sure that we don't forget the shoulders, or the shoulders of the shoulders, those who came before that. We have to get into the history and make sure that all of our fathers, all of our mothers are given their just due, because we are now, Prince Israel was already there, but you and I, Nasi, we're knocking down the door, we're beating on the door of being an elder. I'm only 1 year away, technically, from being 50. You're on your way as well. And we do not want to be forgotten. We're just like Ezra and Nehemiah. Y'all remember us for good always. We don't want to be forgotten. But in order to be remembered, you have to do remembering too. Remember who came before you and gave you the platform. So when I start talking, that's why I start off everything with giving honor and respect to our elders. Chief of Chiefs Naphtali, the Most High bless his memory. All the individuals that influence me, or the individuals that influence everybody here, we have to give them their flowers, because we're going to want flowers soon as well.